Welcome back to another exciting episode of Grains on Tap. I'm your host, Kyle Larkin, Executive Director of Grain Growers of Canada, and I'm looking forward to taking you on another journey through the intersection of agriculture and politics. So pour yourself a cold one and settle in as we explore the policies crafting our agricultural landscape right here on Grains on Tap. Our guest today has a long history of working on agriculture policy and representing farmers. Francis Drouin is the Member of Parliament for Glengarry-Prescott-Russell here in Ontario and is the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Agriculture and Agri-Food. First elected to the House of Commons in 2015, Francis has been a constant advocate for farmers and economic growth in rural areas. He also understands the intersection of government and public affairs, having worked on our side of things in government relations, both as a consultant and for a not-for-profit. We're really excited to have him here to share his story and perspectives. Frank, it's great to have you with us. How are you doing?
Great. It's fantastic. I mean, it's really hard to say yes or no, I guess, when you're inviting me for a conversation and having a beer at the same time.
Yeah, that's always hard to say no to. But talking about beer, let's kick things off there. So I'll start off, and of course, I had to choose Bose, our friends from Glengarry-Prescott-Russell. I think you might have brought Bose as well. Folks who know me know I'm a big IPA guy, so I had to go with the full-time IPA. Great hazy any IPA from Bose and Frank's riding. So I'm looking forward to drinking this today. Frank, what do you got for us?
So I went with Bose and the Lug Shred. So their most famous beer, but it's also a signal of where they started. So they started with Lug Shred back in 2006 on a golf course, and I remember them well. And the barriers they had to go through. It's a little funny story, if I can say it. The Bose logo has 3 wheels, if you notice here, and the original logo had 4 wheels, but the Alcohol and Gaming Commission in Ontario had decided that it was too risky. They were promoting drinking and driving, so they had to get rid of 1 wheel. But it's a story I'm always going to remember. Red tape.
That's amazing. That's amazing. Wow. I did not know that story. So thank you for that. Hey, look, just like a 3-legged dog. I'm sure a 3-wheeled tractor can keep going too, you know? Awesome. Well, I've got a bunch of questions for you here, but I want to dive into the breaking news we had today on the advance payments program. Big news coming from the minister. Tell us a bit about it, Frank. What's going on there?
Yeah, so Kyle, I want to link this with our podcast that we're hosting tonight, or that you're hosting tonight, and me not wanting to come up and not share some good news. So obviously you and Grain Growers of Canada and every other ag stakeholders in Ottawa had been advocating for an increase in the amount of the advance payment program. Today, officially, we made the announcement that amount, it was normally at $100,000. It went up to $250, went up to $350 in the past because of input costs. Government's realizing, and Minister, the one plea that he made with the Minister of Finance was to increase that amount again for year 2024 to $250,000, which, given the interest environment, and we're still relatively in an high input cost environment.
Big time.
Probably, yeah, and may differ from last year, like in terms of fertilizer prices, but we're still in a high cost environment, and that's just a recognition that the government has made for this year. So great news for the sector. And Kyle and the board, I want to thank you for making the proper advocacy amongst our members and the entire ag community. So
well, we really appreciate that, but I have to commend you. I have to commend the minister, commend the government. It's big news. I think the thing we appreciate the most is having it before April 1st, the predictability for both administrators and grain farmers going into the APP season, if you want to call it that, is super, super crucial. I mean, I've spoken with dozens of grain farmers this year already who have asked me, well, what's the amount this year, Kyle? Like, I'm hearing it's 100, I'm hearing it's 350. Well, like, tell me. And I'm like, well, we have to wait till the government tells us. And, last year we kind of got a surprise on budget night. This year, I'm super appreciative that you folks have put this out early, so we know what to expect going into the next budget. The other thing too is, look, the average grain farmer takes about $250,000. So going to interest free at $250, that's going to help thousands of grain farmers across Canada. So really appreciative of that investment.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd say like normally the program was when it was at 100,000, but we were in a low interest environment and low input environment. The program may not have been used as much, especially when
Right.
interest rates were down on the floor. But since interest rates have gone up, we've seen a huge uptake. So again, just great news for ag sector.
Great news. Yeah, the cost of
Yeah,
fertilizer, seeds, pesticides, that's not going down. So
yeah.
totally get where you're coming from. But let's talk a little bit about you. You grew up in a Franco-Ontarian community that you now represent. Can you tell us a little bit about your upbringing in a rural French community in Ontario? Pretty unique.
Yeah, no, I did. So I was born and raised in Hawkesbury. I wasn't really involved in politics other than my dad and my grandfather. My dad was mayor of the town. My grandfather was a municipal councillor. But I didn't get involved in student politics. I didn't come up from that particular world. I paid attention to it, but I went to French school. I also went to an English school. My dad, understanding that he had a language handicap. He couldn't speak both official languages properly, so he wanted me to get a good education in both official languages. So I went to Vankleek-Hill as well. Learned that's where I saw most of the farmers in Vankleek-Hill.
Right.
And one of my first job was picking berries at the end of a season, which is not it's not good for your pocket. Picking berries
It's
at
hard
the end of
work
the
too.
season,
Yeah.
it's hard work, and you're not picking a lot for that too. And I think at the time I remember we were picking raspberries for $2.50 per pint. So I didn't put a lot for retirement back then, but it's good. It was a good upbringing, and I always said this. I didn't grow up on a farm, but I would help buddies when it was hay season. They needed the extra labor, so they called their urban friends. And I came from a town that's about 10,000 people, so it was not
Right.
what isn't a big town, but I'd go working out there for helping and get our arms all scraped up and whatnot. Showing, I like to say my friends showed me what was true hard work, I guess. But quiet upbringing. I played a little bit of hockey, but wasn't really good at it. I preferred snowboarding. Individual sports was my thing. But yeah, I mean, I lived 45 minutes away from the Laurentians, so going to the ski hill was more of my thing.
How's the snowboarding going today?
Haven't been in almost in 8 years. I've been
Oh,
twice,
that's too
and
bad.
I've been twice, and I started skiing. So, but eventually I'll get back to some of those activities. My son's growing, so eventually he'll want to take it up. Yeah.
Well, look, I growing up, I worked in construction, and jobs like that, working in agriculture or construction or whatever it is, it really makes you appreciate the later jobs you have in your life, be it member of parliament or whatever it might be. But so you grew up in Hawkesbury. What would you say was kind of your first introduction to politics? How did you get into this crazy world of politics?
So yeah, as I said, like my parents, so my dad and my grandfather were both involved in politics, and you grow up. I was younger, maybe I was 8, 7, or since I was born. Actually, my dad was in politics, but he quit in '94, so I would have been 11 years old.
Right.
So I always said, rather than talking about hockey at the dinner table, we talk about politics and solving the world problems, and just understanding that Saturday mornings, my dad at the time, you still had phone books and people knew your local phone numbers. So I'd get calls in the morning, and I'd go to constituent calls. The basement flooded. It's the mayor's fault. Call the mayor. And my dad,
Right.
out of the goodness of his heart, he'd go check in and just try and be helpful. So that's the world I grew up in. But later on, like at 16, 17 years old, I've always had an attachment, and I grew up in a liberal family. I've always said if I voted another way, my grandfather would turn around in his grave and crucify me, if I can say that. Um, but I was 17, and I said, you know what, I'm going to join the Liberal Party, see what it's all about, see if I like it for myself. And and the question was, do I like this because my dad and my grandfather like this, or do I like this because I have a personal interest in it? And eventually back in 2004, so I was, 20, almost 20 years old, or 21 years old. And the big debate at the time was same-sex marriage. And I was a young liberal. And at that time, even the Liberals, we were the governing party, but not all of them were convinced. So it was a big battle. And I saw
Right.
that at the time where, hey, I'm only 19, 20 years old, and I have an ability to affect change and put pressure on my own party. And I'm always going to remember what Paul Martin said when he was talking to the young Liberals. He says, you guys keep rocking the boat, meaning, shake the boat, don't accept the status quo. Yeah, there's always the old guards that are there, but rock them a little bit, shake them a little bit, and eventually change will come, right? So.
Well, it's great advice. And after that, if I read your bio correctly, you got into Ontario politics. Is that right?
I did. So I got an internship back in 2004, got involved a little bit with the Premier's office, and then in 2008, so I did that. And while I was still going to school, worked part-time. And in 2008, I quit provincial politics and I went to work in government relations. And even at that time, I said, I love politics, I love policy, but I hate the politicians and the political life. Who wants to take their weekends away and having to go to some event somewhere where you're away from your family? And that takes a toll on everybody that has to do that. But then in 2014, I ran the provincial members campaign, and I've always said that's where I caught the bug. I went back home. I ran. It was MPP crack at the time. We won the campaign, but it was that's where I caught the bug. I'm like, okay, timing's right, and politics is always about timing, right?
Yep.
You could see the winds of change coming from almost a tenure of the Harper government, which agree or disagree. 10 years, normally people get sick of governments, and that's what happens in the history of Canada.
Yep.
And I caught the bug, and here I am.
Here you are. Yeah. Yeah, here you are. So hated politicians, and now you are a politician. So I hope you don't hate yourself.
No.
Come on.
I'm still working with my therapist on that one. No.
Oh, jeez. Well, let's rewind just a little bit back to your life in the beautiful world, the exciting world of government relations. Obviously I've been in the GR world for quite some time now. I quite enjoy it. You were a consultant. You also worked for a not-for-profit. How would you say those experiences shape some of your engagement today, knowing how kind of both sides of the fence work?
Yeah, tremendously. I spent most of my time working with government. There was only one bill which I would brag to my buddies that I worked on, which was the legalization of mixed martial art, that I got to work with parliamentarians a little bit. So I knew more conservative members of parliament than I knew my own kind, which I said the Liberals because we were 35 at that time. But of course, that allowed me to, and it gave me an exposure on private members' procedures. But 80% of my time was spent with the public servants and working on procurement and defense procurement and IT procurement, and understanding how government works. And that, to me, what is a Treasury Board submission, which I would argue many members of Parliament to this day still don't know how you get an ask into the system and how it works. And that, to me, was those are just tools that you acquired that gives you a chance to use those particular tools, whether, even before I was a parliamentary secretary I'm not minister, and I'll never become a minister, but it just gives you those tools to understand and provide some advice either to the community that you're trying to serve or to the issue that you're trying to advance. So I'd say, to me, that normally it's the opposite, right? We spend some time in government and then we move on to the GR world. I did a bit of both, and I found that to be extremely helpful.
Awesome. Well, I would say never say never on your ministerial hopes, my friend.
Maybe that's right. In politics, we never say never, but
awesome. So you got elected in 2015. Obviously, you've been an MP now for over 8 years. Any memorable moments or challenges you can think of?
That's always tough for me to answer. Always, I don't have a favorite moment. I have multiple moments. I mean, I could. One funny story I tell in the riding is in the community of Maxville, where it's a funny moment. I think it's hilarious because Maxville, great town. It's the home of the Glengarry Highland Games. But they were lacking water from a reliable source, so everybody was on wells, and we got them money from a federal program, and the province kicked in and whatnot. And in 2015, I had 52 votes, and after the announcement in 2019, I still had 52 votes. So it's a memorable moment because it's hilarious. I did it for the right reasons and not for political reasons. But sometimes politicians are bound by, oh well, if I make certain announcement, I'll be popular. No, you're not.
Right.
Some people are very predestined. But that to me is, I think it's hilarious. I tell it to the local newspaper. I think it's a funny story. I don't hold anything back against it. I've enjoyed working on that particular project. A great memorable moment. The other one would have been getting through CUSMA. Personally,
Right.
as you know, Kyle, I come from I have both worlds in my writing, but I come from a supply managed world. But I also come from a grains world, so it was always challenging to balance both of the needs. And getting through CUSMA to me was that's all we ever talked about, right? Like in the first 4 years, it was just trade deals after trade deals after trade deals, which are important. I realize for the grain sector to access other markets, but it does provide some pressure back home in terms of, yes, we want more access, but don't give up on SM. And I say both can be true at the same time, but
Exactly.
those were challenging moments, I would say. When you're hosting a meeting in Saint-Isidore, which is almost the middle of the riding, and you get 300 angry farmers showing up at your meeting,
Yep.
things are not going well. When you host a meeting and nobody shows up, things are going well.
That's
Yeah.
right. That's right. Look, I was in Drummondville, Quebec, just last week
Yep.
for the Producteurs de Grains du Québec's AGM, and there was over 300 grain farmers in attendance. And I can tell you that a good portion of them don't just do grain, right? A lot of them
Right.
have dairy, a lot of them have chicken. They've got multiple operations going on. So just like you said, it's a balance in everything. Obviously, we're opposed to C282. We think our trade negotiators shouldn't have their hands tied in any way. But at the same time, we're not saying open up supply management. We're not saying get rid of supply management. We're saying that when you go into trade negotiations, everything's balanced out. And you just have to have everything on the table. Not that you're going to give everything up, but you just have to
Yeah.
have everything available to you. Totally agree with you. So, member of parliament, and then you get into the parliamentary secretary seat for the Minister of Agriculture and Agri-Food in 2021, who at that time was Marie-Claude Bibeau. How would you say that experience has been as a PS in general, and how has the transition to Minister Macaulay been? Because you've now served for two ministers. So talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I'd say, well, under Madame Bibeau, maybe I would spend more time in English Canada, I call it, because she would, because of language, she's more prominent in French, and I have the beauty of understanding two languages, but I get sent to Alberta, in some areas where she can go because she's tied up in some other areas. So I'd say that politically for me, now the tables have turned. Minister Macaulay is taking more comfortable in English. And because of language, I'm spending more time in Quebec. So
Right.
politically, that's what's changed. But I would say I still spend just as much time with stakeholders, regardless of where they're from. And I always want to know and try and be helpful as to where they're coming from. And we talk, right? Like, so Cody Blois, for instance, him and I are close. We keep a close relationship because we know whomever wants to form government, you need that urban area. So by default, 10% of Canadians stay in rural Canada now. So we need more louder voices and effective voices. And I certainly am not going to say I'm the most effective voice, but I have colleagues that are effective, and I keep working with them in order to advance our interests. And when I say our, agricultural interests. Yeah.
Well, we definitely appreciate your advocacy. Look, there's let's be clear. There's not a lot of Liberal members of Parliament who are in rural ridings across Canada. We could start there, right? Certainly aren't a lot of bilingual members of Parliament
Yeah.
in rural ridings. So you're in a fairly unique position. Talking about your engagement in Quebec, you reminded me of some of your engagement internationally in la francophonie.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about that experience, because that's a pretty unique experience as well. I know you've been involved with that organization quite some time. Tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, so since July 2022, I chair the International Parliamentary Francophone Assembly, which and it's hard to talk about it in English because I never
Yeah.
talk about it in English. But so that represents about 90 members, which over 71 of them are states. So France. Luxembourg, Swiss, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And a lot of them we do share. It's mostly based on parliamentary diplomacy, but I do learn about, of course, wearing an ag hat. I always ask about agriculture and some of the pressures that are happening in certain areas. And the most recent one would be Europe. And I was in Brussels because of La Francophonie in late January, and I could see the rise happening. It was already happening, but in France, what amplified that further was the accident that happened where a mother and a daughter were killed because somebody decided that the protest was enough, and they didn't know that there were people behind the bale of hay, and 2 people died. But I was like, okay, what's going on over there? Why are they pleading? What's happening? And it sort of started in Germany, and then Europe, because of geography, everything's close. It sort of percolates everywhere. But it's also a recognition of, to me, it's a signal that any policy you put forward, farmers have a right to a livelihood. And whether it's an environment policy, whether it's an economic policy, the right to own land, I believe that in those conversations, farmers have to be involved, and farmers have to protect their livelihoods. And I say this with the utmost respect to all of my other colleagues, but I live in a rural area. I know the economic contribution they are making. If I lose farms, or if it's owned only by one person, or if we move to a U.S. models where most of our farmers are now renting land, that's not good. That is not good. And when I see the future where I don't have yet the answer is farm ownership and property ownership, and that's where a trend that's happening in the U.S. has gone too far, and I don't want to see that happening in Canada.
Totally agree, and I think most of our listeners probably would be nodding their heads violently right now. Look, we want to work with the government. When you look at things like the fertilizer emission reduction target, that's something that was taken from abroad and kind of plopped here in Canada. It's voluntary now. Take it as you will, but it's still something that's concerning, right? Exactly what you were kind of saying, telling farmers what to do and not really supporting their livelihoods. Like you said, they're small family businesses. Farmers across Canada are small family businesses. I think more members of parliament should understand that. More MPs in general should go on a farm tour. Like Frank, I know you've been on hundreds, maybe dozens of farms, let's say. Most MPs haven't, and I think it's a really beneficial experience when you can get out there and you can see exactly how these grain farms or whatever type of farm operates. It's a pretty enlightening experience, but totally agreed with you that we're talking about private lands here. We're talking about small family businesses. Little segue into your role, talking about your role as parliamentary secretary again, but also as your role as a member of the agriculture and agri-food committee that you've been on for quite some time. Through those different experiences, what do you see as the priorities for the sector moving forward? And what are you personally seeing in the House of Commons as it relates to agriculture policy?
Yeah, I mean, if we're talking a lot of what we're talking, and even internationally is driven by the reduction of GHG emissions and whatnot. And when I say protect farm livelihood, I really meant that. But I also when we talk about the contributions that farmers are making to the environment, how much CO2 are they capturing? And I think we're almost there, but I think when farmers give a benefit to society, while society does not go and sit on properties they don't own the particular property, but the fact that farmers are planting crops, the fact that those crops are capturing CO2, I believe that society should be rewarding that. We just haven't figured out the proper way to provide that reward, and at the same time, making sure that when we do measure that it's not cumbersome. I mean, no farmers want to have an audit, a yearly audit or on their particular farms, but I think technology is catching up in order to ease that. And if I'm capturing CO2, then there should be I should be paid, and that's an opportunity for farmers to have a second source of revenue. If I'm keeping grasslands on my property, I should be paid. I'm providing a benefit. If society's saying don't cut down your trees because I'm not farming, it's not good for the environment, or I'm not farming that, then I should be paid for that, right? So I think we're on our way there. We're not there yet, but anybody who has solutions or who has I would say, has seen what other countries are doing in terms of that, then yeah, absolutely. And then trade, right? The world is getting unstable.
Yeah.
And we've, whether it's the war in Ukraine, some famines that are happening in some African countries because of the war in Ukraine, then Canada is going to become that reliable partner that we always have been. But so when I talk about the Indo-Pacific strategy, for instance, there's a huge market that we're tapping into, but there's a lot more. That middle class over there is growing like crazy. There's a lot more market access that we can have, and they love our product. They love our product. We're a trusted partner on that particular front. So yeah, we should be participating as much as possible. And then the third one, I'd say when we talk about reducing GHG again, the whole biofuel economy. I think it's great for grain farmers. There's the clean fuel standard that created that gives them an opportunity on the particular biofuel standard. The U.S. are there; they're involved. We're involved. So I think and this is the one play I made with the U.S. If we had a North American strategy in order to, we all benefit. I mean, north-south traffic is the reality of our economy.
Yeah.
Many economists have tried to promote east-west traffic, but you and I will have a lot more gray hair by the time that happens. So if we are to continue moving, and if our infrastructure is built that way, then let's promote our North American economy, and our grain farmers are well positioned to participate in that in the biofuel economy. And technology will have a huge role to play in that. So innovation. So how do we grow more within the same acres of land? We've done a great job, but as always, in 50 years, I'm sure they're going to say, "Wow, they used to farm like that. What the heck?" Right? Just as we're doing right now.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, you hit on a lot of great points there. I mean, biofuels is a huge opportunity for grain farmers across Canada. Especially canola farmers. Obviously, we already have billions of dollars being deployed across the prairies and building new canola crushing facilities. That's a big bonus for farmers across the prairies. Number two is there's billions of dollars also waiting in provinces out west for biofuel refineries. So not only are we going to create more jobs and more markets through the crushers, but we're also going to create a circular economy here in Canada where you have the grain farmer growing canola, sells the canola to the crushing facility where it gets crushed into oil. That oil goes to the processing plant somewhere in Canada, and then it goes back to the farmer to use in their combine, and all of that to reduce greenhouse gas emissions while also growing the profitability of grain farmers. It's a great story that I like to talk about all the time.
Absolutely. And I find even for exporting opportunities, if we're not dealing with biofuels, the more we are able to value add our products in Canada, the less trade irritant that there could be done at the end of the cycle, right? So that's, to me, if we're exporting raw products, and I get there's a market for everything,
Yeah.
but I have plenty of time to give to anybody who says, I want to build a processing or manufacturing plant in order to process more grains in Canada so I can export somewhere else. Then I know that I'm not going to have to deal with them if we have an issue with a particular country. I'm not going to mention names, but non-trade barriers are quick to come up when there's an irritant somewhere. And it's harder to do when you have a finished product.
Yeah, and look, you talk about north-south trade. That's a definite. The other thing I would say too is though we're in competition with the U.S. right now. They're building tons of crushing facilities for their soy farmers. They've got a ton of refining capacity across the U.S. Right now, we're shipping a lot of canola oil down south. We could keep that canola ourselves, create jobs here in Canada, grow our GDP, and also benefit the profitability of grain farmers while also lowering emissions. It's a win-win-win as far as I see it. So totally agree with you on that front, on the clean fuel standard and the way it's supporting grain farmers. Look, I want to talk about little bit of an elephant in the room, a little bit maybe controversial topic. Our favorite bill, Bill C-234. Um, as the Parliamentary Secretary for Agriculture for the side of the House opposing this bill, but also being a member of Parliament that represents hundreds of farmers, this obviously has put you in a difficult position, kind of a man in the middle, you could say. Can you speak a little bit about your thoughts on C-234?
Yeah, and so the origin of this bill, Bill C-206, I believe, that was presented by Phil Lawrence, I was supportive. And the rationale is simple for me. I made a commitment to two farmers back home, one of them who is not with us anymore. And I can't go back, and I've explained this to everybody in my own party. I cannot go back to this particular person and explain to him why I changed my mind. He's no longer with us, and I made a commitment to him, and I will continue supporting my position on that. But also, I do recognize, and I understand the government's position. The government's position is, listen, we're getting so many asks from other sectors, and it's not necessarily about the ag sector. It's about all the other sectors that are also asking for a particular exemption on this particular matter. And if we give one to them, then we have to, the other sector is going to say, well, you gave it to the ag sector. How about the fish sector? So I get where they're coming from. So right now the bill's in the House of Commons. Nobody else has put up speakers other than the party that has been most vocal about it. So I don't think I need to explain who that particular party is. But the other answer, Kyle, the other thing I will say, exemption now, but what do we do later? And that's carbon levies that are popping up and starting to pop up in other jurisdictions. The UK's talk as of 2027, there will be a carbon levy, which means if I'm importing goods from a country that does not have a price on carbon, then you are subject to a carbon levy. So, so that's the other conversation we need to have at the same time, because even the US is having that conversation as well. And if government is not supportive of C-234, fine. But hey, government, help me transition. Help me lower my emissions on my farm. I'll do it, but I'm not willing to pay. I've got capital investments that I must make, and technology. There are some technology that's available, but it's not yet available to the wide masses, and it's not, I'd say, efficient right now or cost effective to procure those particular technologies. So these are, and this, aside from the politics of all of this, I think those are the serious conversations that we need to have within our communities in terms of saying, okay, if we're subject to trade exportation, and there could be a world where we live in with a carbon levy. So what do we do? Right. And that's always and I'm always open. I don't necessarily have all the answers, but that's where I'm focused on and saying, okay, exemption until 2030, fully support it. But what happens after?
Right.
That's another subject. Yeah.
Well, after 2030, I mean, obviously the hope is we have some viable alternatives, right? I think most grain farmers would look at something if there was a viable alternative. Obviously, the energy pressure that you need from propane or natural gas, that's not there for the technology we have today. But look, first of all, total respect to you for your commitment to that farmer in your riding who unfortunately passed away. That's an amazing story. So thank you for sharing that with us. And number two, I mean, you've talked a bit about international trade. Certainly looking at carbon levies, that's a possibly trade distorting policy. The other challenge too is it's a balancing act, right? I can definitely see the European Union going that way fairly quickly, but other markets like China or even the US market may not go that way as fast as that. So, international trade's always a balance and balancing things out like that. Yeah. Uh, as the PS for Ag, so we're going to stay on this theme here a bit. One of the priorities for agriculture and Agri-Food Canada has been the development of a sustainable agriculture strategy. You've obviously heard about this. Grain Growers of Canada remains engaged through the SAS Advisory Committee, but the work remains fairly behind the scenes. Can you speak as to why the SAS is important to the government?
Yeah, I think so. Overall, all sectors have been asked to reduce their GHG emissions. So, they've identified, and the world looks at Canada. Okay, 10% of your emissions are contributing to CO2. So that's where that number starts. So what does the ag sector start? Well, we've announced a few programs to help reduce, and some of them are more controversial. The fertilizer emissions piece, I would say, we did a shitty job. Pardon my language, pardon my French, but we did a shitty job at announcing it of what it was. But it was also mixed with what was happening in Holland, and everybody sort of jumped on. You're trying to you're going to mandate us to shut down our farms. I was like, no, we're not. And expropriate us. We're not doing that. I sincerely believe, having after spoken with the University of Saskatchewan, we're almost there. It's just a problem of how do we measure and how do we measure that baseline.
Yep.
They haven't figured this out. They're working on it, and I know they're going to come up with a solution. So SAS, or the Sustainable Ag Strategy, I'd say one of the components will be research in areas where we don't necessarily have all the data yet. But I certainly believe why SAS is important. Of course, the environment, but even more importantly, I would say the economy and the consumers. More and more and more consumers. The entire world, 90% of the world lives in an urban area, and they have an environmental conscience, and they want to know that their products was grown sustainably. So what a great story Canada could say. You know what? I was able to grow my grains, operate my farm, whatever it is you're doing. And by the way, it's net zero. And I find that, of course, there's going to be activities where it's going to create CO2 or methanes. Like there's going to be some, but that possibility is also able to offset. When I talked about those benefits of, I have a property, I have trees on them, or I took an anaerobic digester, and my cattle, all the manure that's out there, it's now producing electricity.
Right.
So all these sorts of, or I've got cover crops on my particular farm. I'm doing no-till agriculture. All of these things are able. We're just not measuring them properly yet, and I think the sector's sort of working on that. And again, trying to find that balance in terms of that measurement and not having it to being cumbersome to farmers, like having auditors in your farm and grabbing soil samples. No, but I haven't been in Saskatchewan at the farm show. Technology is catching up really quickly. And pretty soon you're going to be able to have testers in the ground and just having it on your phone and being able to live say something, tell them live that, hey, I'm capturing X amount of CO2, or, today I released X amount of CO2. So I find that the SAS strategy is extremely important to reduce our GHG emissions. But more importantly is that because of that, we're able to tell the world that we're producing food, we're feeding you. And by the way, we're contributing positively to the environment.
Yeah, and I would pick up on your piece about measurement, right? You look at how do we measure these things, and I can tell you that Canada has one of the most sustainable ag sectors in the world. Can we do more? Everybody can do more. We can all do more individually and as groups, as sectors, et cetera. But we have to first of all talk about where Canada's ag sector is at. We're in a pretty good place when you compare us internationally, especially when you compare us to Europe, which is funny when you say it, but it's true. The second thing I would pick up on what you said is, looking at that compensation. And the thing I would pick up on there is early adopters as well. Folks out out west have been doing zero-till conservation tillage for years, if not decades. Then you have farmers in the east who have been doing cover cropping for decades. Both practices lower greenhouse gas emissions, both allow for greater carbon sequestration. But we're not there yet in terms of how we calculate that. But once we get there, and hopefully we get there soon, we have to figure out what that compensation is. Because certainly, I know there's companies, big multinational companies, that are looking to buy carbon credits, and I personally believe there are carbon credits there that farmers should be able to make money off of. And the last thing I would say is sustainability, international competitiveness, and profitability have to all be in the same conversation. We can't risk, obviously, the livelihood of grain farmers.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say the protection of farm livelihood is also making its way. I was at COP27. Even environmentalists are talking about that. They understand that if if I can't feed my family, then your climate change issue, it doesn't become a long-term issue. It becomes an immediate need. I don't care about your climate change issue. I have to feed my family tomorrow morning. So if society falls, and the same thing for when I talk to vegans and they say don't eat meat to protect the environment. Well, my answer to that is no. Focus on decarbonizing the process as opposed to telling people not what to do, because you're not going to get far with that
Right.
particular language, right? So, but I don't control all voices. I I certainly listen to a lot of them, but I don't control. But Kyle, you're right. Let's focus on decarbonizing the process. Let's make sure that farmers can protect their livelihood and can still feed their families and make a little bit of profit, because they too are allowed to make a profit. And they will continue doing what they do best, and that's to feed our cities, if I can say so.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Running a bit short on time here. I got one last question for you, Frank. GGC, we're pretty heavily involved in right to repair, specifically pushing for C244 294 that recently went through the House of Commons in the fall. At the same time, your government's doing a consultation on right to repair, specifically as it relates to agricultural equipment. Are you hearing anything on this issue in Parliament Hill or in your community? Where are you at on right to repair?
So I'm completely supportive. Obviously, there's been some court cases down south and in Europe, and some jurisdictions have moved to a complete right to repair. But it's important that not one particular manufacturer holds the rights or the copyrights to repair their particular machinery. The sector might say, well, if they modify their machinery, then it may no longer work, blah, 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 blah. I've heard this before. My view is ag is becoming a lot more technology, like there's a lot more technology on the farm. I'm hearing stories of, I'm very concerned about interoperability of those machinery and those systems. And that's why right to repair is extremely important, because ag is moving into, it's already there, but it's going to be further adapted. So when we talk about precision farming, I may be driving a John Deere tractor, but my systems that I've adopted, and we tend to talk about those who are in the market space right now, but there can be some disturbers in there that walk in and completely disrupt what's already available, because I support that, right? If it's good for farmers, I will always support it. But that's where I'm at. I mean, because of the interoperability issue, and because also, like, I'm hearing stories locally, right? Like, I had to pay somebody $500 just to plug it in or get access to the X company. They're all the same, by the way. They're all the same. So it's. I think it's high time that the farmers' voice got heard, and if our European cousins were able to do it, so can Canada.
Yeah, you're bang on. I mean, one of the challenges is, just only a few decades ago, we were really talking about mechanical pieces of equipment that farmers bought, they owned, and they could fix on their own with parts, and they'd fix it on their phone on their farms. Now we're really talking about pieces of equipment that are more computers than they are mechanical, and the mechanical pieces farmers can still fix. But the issue is we're having more software issues more than ever, and there's so many different issues here. First of all, we know that dealerships and manufacturers have huge labor shortages. So that's creating a huge backlog in repair. If you're a grain farmer wherever in Canada and it's harvest season, you have a very short amount of time to be able to repair your combine when you need it. You cannot wait 2 weeks to get it repaired. You need it now. So that's a huge issue. The other big issue too is you have some of these manufacturers that will give you the diagnostic software, but they'll lease it to you on a yearly fee, which could be in the thousands of dollars. Look, grain farmers, like I said before, are small family businesses. They don't have extra thousands of dollars to be spending willy-nilly. So it's a big issue, but I appreciate your advocacy, appreciate your support on it.
And Kyle, we didn't even get talking about cybersecurity, but that's another subject that we could talk to about an hour. Yeah. That's all related to that particular aspect. And
AI too.
It is. Yes. And it goes on and on and on.
Yeah. Well, before I wrap up here, Frank, any final thoughts? You've given us your time here. Really appreciate it. Any final thoughts you want to leave us with?
No, Kyle, I just want to thank you once again. The APP announcement was very timely for myself, so I didn't have to get, your gears on this particular podcast. Right. So thank you so much. And to your listeners, keep up the good work in Ottawa.
Thanks, Frank. Well, I didn't realize Grains on Tap was so important that we got a fresh news release right before this. So thank you. But that brings us to the end of this episode of Grains on Tap. I want to give a big thank you to our guest, Frank Drouin, for sharing his story and perspectives with us today. We appreciate his working and bridging the gap between grain farmers and government, both as a member of Parliament and Parliamentary Secretary. Remember, if you enjoyed this episode and want to hear more, make sure to subscribe and stay tuned for more conversations from across the country. A special thanks to Beer Canada for making this podcast possible. Cheers from the Grains on Tap, and we'll catch you on the next episode.